Hi, I'm Bill Vales. For this segment of Your Backyard, we're in the beautiful LCTV studios with Chris Pryor. Chris is the Director of Forest Stewardship of the New England Forestry Foundation that has its headquarters on the Prouty Woods Community Forest here in Littleton, Mass. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. Chris, what is NEFF? At least that's the short version of that long name. What is it?
So New England Forestry Foundation is a private nonprofit organization that's dedicated to the conservation and stewardship of New England's forests.
I see. And is it exclusively New England forest?
Primarily. Occasionally we'll work outside of New England if the right project comes around.
Okay. How many acres, and is that how you measure your land? Because the land is probably fairly vast, but how many acres are under the stewardship?
Well, there's two different categories. There's land that we own, and we own about 140 parcels of land around New England, totaling more than 26,000 acres, and that's in 5 different states.
Wow.
But then we also hold conservation easements, and we hold more than 1.1 million acres of conservation easements, and that's in about also 150 or so different parcels around New England.
1.1 million.
Yes.
Acres. That's significant. What states are they located in? Are they throughout all of the New England states?
Except for Rhode Island. So we own land in 5 of the New England states. Like I said, all of them except for Rhode Island, scattered between, from northwestern Connecticut up through northern Vermont and kind of mid-coast Maine for the lands that we own. And our easements spread from the tips of Maine down through Connecticut and Massachusetts, but we also have some parcels outside of New England that we hold under conservation easement as well.
Okay. What's the largest parcel of land that you own?
The largest piece of land that we own is the Braintree Mountain Forest. It's about 1,500 acres in Braintree, Vermont.
Braintree, Vermont.
Yeah, and that's the largest piece that we own.
Okay.
Our largest conservation easement is the Pingree Conservation Easement, which is almost 750,000 acres in northern and western Maine. It's actually more than 750,000 acres.
I see. Is an easement, does that put the land under permanent stewardship or?
Permanent protection. So the conservation easement basically would remove certain rights from the property, primarily development, mining, paving, dumping, some of those kinds of things to ensure that the property's highest and best use in the future is good long-term forest management and forestry. So the private landowners still own it. They still get to make the decisions on how to manage it, where to do certain management activities, those kinds of things. But it removes the possibility of development, essentially.
I see. What does forest management entail?
Forest management is broadly, I would say, would be a set of choices or actions you would do in the forest to manipulate the vegetation, maybe the wildlife species, in order to meet the landowner's objectives for that property. So it could range from no activity, managing it more for a wilderness area and the wildlife species and the aesthetic benefits that we get from that, to a more intensively managed forest that could produce periodic income through timber sales, producing wood products, and also creating maybe a more diverse set of wildlife habitats as well.
I see. It sounds like with the easement that the owners that grant the easement are an active participant in the management of that land. Is that correct?
Yes. The management is essentially primarily in their hands, and you would usually work with a forester, a private consulting forester, to implement those decisions and that kind of thing. But NEFF doesn't have a role or a say in how the management takes place. There's some broad restrictions in those conservation easements to guide that, but a lot of the the detailed on-the-ground decisions are left up to the landowner and, their foresters.
I see. Now, the land that NEFF owns, how is that managed?
So we create our own management plan, our regional management plan for our entire ownership around New England, but then work with a set of private consulting foresters around New England that do a more detailed inventory and management plan for each individual parcel around New England. And they base those management plans on our overall objectives to help us meet those objectives and recommend certain actions, and then we hire them to also carry out those actions if it's a prescribed timber sale or invasive control project or other habitat enhancement project, those kinds of things.
Okay. Now, you mentioned an interesting word when you said inventory. That says to me you're counting things. And what goes into doing an inventory on a parcel of land that's 1,000 acres?
Sure. Well, the foresters would set up a grid and take inventory points throughout the property where they're recording a lot of the traditional forest inventory kind of statistics, whether it's the tree species, the individual tree's diameter, its height, and the number of logs that were in it, and the types of products and those kinds of things. But they would also look at things like regeneration in the area, any invasive plants, any forest health issues there might be, if there's insects or diseases that we would need to address, a whole host of things. But some of those some of that main data would get statistically analyzed to give us an estimate of volume and timber distribution across our entire property.
I see. So when you say you grid it off, our audience can, in their mind's eye, look at a piece of graph paper, if you will, and effectively you're placing a grid over the land, and then you count
at each
various
intersection
things.
point, you would have an inventory point where you would collect. There's different ways to do it, but essentially at each one of those inventory points, we could count the number of trees that are within a certain plot.
I see.
And use statistics to calculate the total volume on the stand.
Yeah. And do you find the statistics generally, because you're using a smaller sample than the total, but in general, do you find the statistics really bear out the
there's
fairly
been
accurate
a
populations?
lot of research over the decades and centuries probably to work out these inventory systems and get them as good as they can be.
Yeah. So you count insects?
We wouldn't necessarily count insects, but we would note any, like I said, forest health issues. If there was a specific area that was infested with certain insects that were causing a problem, we would note that and be able to come back and treat that.
I see. And do you do any notations of bird life and larger mammals? And
yeah, there'd be, some of that stuff is more anecdotal and not worked into the statistical analysis, but it is noted and included in those management plans.
Yeah, of course, some of those things, trees stay fixed in an area, and vegetation will somewhat stay fixed, and animals and birds are fairly transient in what they do. That sounds interesting. So, do you yourself participate in those inventories?
Somewhat, yes. So we have those. We do two sets of inventories. We do kind of a landscape scale inventory system where we have random plots spread out across our 26,000 acres in New England to give us a kind of overall inventory, and we use that to figure out what we call our annual allowable cut. We're trying to essentially maintain a steady inventory, and by doing that inventory every year, we can figure out how much we're growing and essentially how much we want to be able to harvest every year. But then on those individual forests, the consulting foresters are the ones that are going out and doing those inventories. Yeah.
Does the harvesting of the forest, you balance that against the diversity as far as diversity, I would think, plays a role in a healthy forest. Is it?
Definitely. It would be a very important component of having a healthy forest. There's a lot of things that we try to balance when we're harvesting any of our properties or portions of any of our properties. One of our big missions is promoting sustainable forestry and demonstrating sustainable forestry. So the forests that we own around New England are essentially demonstration forests. So we use those to try and show other private landowners different methods of practicing good forestry. So that's one thing that comes into play is how our harvests can be used to demonstrate those activities to other folks in the area, both other landowners and the general public.
Nice.
But then we're balancing revenue to the organization to help us further our land conservation work and our education mission, balancing the diversity in the forest, both through a tree species standpoint, age class distribution, habitat types to support different kinds of wildlife. There's a whole host of things that we're trying to balance.
The over at the Prouty land, being a local, I just refer to that as the Prouty land. Is that a demonstration forest over there?
It is, yes. We would say that. We had a harvest there in 2007, 2008, I think over the winter.
Yeah.
So we did a series of smaller patch cuts along with another area where we just did more traditional thinning. And we've held a number of tours there to show people the pros and cons of what we've done. And be happy to show anyone else who's interested and take them for a walk through the woods and show them what we've done.
Geez, that'd be great. Do you hold over there regular walks through the woods or do they just burst in your office like I do?
I wouldn't say we hold regular ones.
Yeah.
We do it periodically as the opportunity arises.
Yeah.
As we've got, like I said, 26,000 acres around New England.
Sure.
We're holding events on properties around New England pretty regularly in our harvest walks and other tours that we're doing. So we don't necessarily do it at one specific forest, every month, or even at Prouty Woods every month, but it can be scattered around and kind of irregularly timed, I guess.
So you must get a range of emotion from people when they see trees cut down.
Yes.
And an area that has first been harvested versus one that has been harvested and allowed to be reclaimed.
Definitely.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about the range of emotion that you see.
Mean, it's hard for folks because they see I think in general people see forests as a little more static than they are, and not as dynamic and resilient. And they are very dynamic. It's just that the changes are occurring over decades or centuries, which is not the typical time frame that humans are used to dealing with. An interesting thing to think about with the landscape here in southern New England, if we think back, this town was probably completely or mostly devoid of trees 150 years ago. It was mostly all pastures and maybe some apple orchards and things like that. So as you drive around town now and see these forests, people often think this is how it always was, this is how it always will be, but it's not true. Like I said, the stone walls that are crisscrossing town are signs of former open land. So the forests are resilient and are able to come back from that massive disturbance. And like I said, they're not used to these kind of abrupt changes in forests. They're used to much slower change in the slow growth of forests and that kind of thing. So when they see drastic change from us harvesting trees, it brings out a lot of emotions. A lot of them are not, they're not too positive. And sometimes it's just a matter of clearing up some misconceptions. Like a lot of times they'll think we're essentially clearing the land and going to be developing it, putting in houses. So clearing that up and saying, no, it's going to remain open. as forest land. It's changed a little bit, but trees will continue to grow and new trees will grow back in the openings, those kinds of things.
Yeah. I've noticed over the last few years a number of species, invasive species, that have kind of taken over the landscape and certainly my yard. Things like bittersweet and other things. Do you see a lot of invasive species?
We do.
Yeah.
Especially probably more in southern New England. There seems to be a higher percentage of them that when we come across those. Prouty Woods is a great example. We've got pretty much all of the worst ones you want right there. The one that I think is the biggest problem for us there is burning bush or winged euonymus. And we've done some work in the past to try to control it, but in places, and we're monitoring that, and we will keep an eye on it, make sure that it's not inhibiting new tree growth. We want to make sure that when we do a timber harvest in areas where invasives occur, that we're still able to get trees to regrow so that the forest can remain or persist.
Yeah. How would you define an invasive species?
Invasive species would be a plant that, in general, they're not native to the area where they're at currently. Well, at least here in Littleton, there's a lot of invasive species that have originated in Europe and Asia. And because they originated in other places, they don't have their natural control agents, either predators or diseases or things that might keep their populations in check. And they're able to outcompete native species around here, whether it's plants or animals, and have some pretty serious negative impacts on those species and the landscape.
Yeah, I've seen bittersweet really going crazy, that being a vine that just wraps itself around it, pretty much anything, and climbs up. But another plant that I've noticed is trumpet vine. And generally, I love trumpet vine because it attracts a lot of hummingbirds. And, so I have it around a foam pole. I hope LD didn't hear that, Littleton Electric. But I have a huge trumpet vine. And I've noticed recently the amount of trumpet vine on my property has become somewhat of a problem.
Yeah.
I've really had to, work to keep that under control. What are some other species that you see?
Common ones that we're dealing with are Japanese barberry, buckthorns. There's common and glossy buckthorn, Japanese knotweed, porcelain berry, Japanese stiltgrass. You go on and on.
Yeah. Now, we were talking before we started about this, well, it's not a new invasive, I mean, it's been around, called giant hogweed or parsnip.
Poison parsnip.
Poison parsnip. And my understanding with that, and I've only seen one in the wild, and that was up in Maine, is it grows quite tall, maybe 8-9 feet tall, and has a beautiful flower on it, like a cabbage, not a cabbage, but a cauliflower. So it's nice white flowers. But apparently if you brush that, it does something with your skin with respect to your skin's ability to protect itself from UV light.
Yes, I've heard that.
And it can have a devastating...
I think a worse rash than poison ivy.
Yes, absolutely. That's interesting. So invasives would really be non-indigenous.
That's a good question. I mean, depends on who you talk to. I mean, there are native species that people could consider invasive. Poison ivy might be one.
Yeah.
Black locust is another one that people in certain places consider invasive.
The tree?
Yeah.
Really? Now, I've always, that's interesting. Black locust, I've always heard to be a valuable resource for fence posts.
Yes.
and I think there's a lot of black locust down the Cape, I think.
Yes, I think you're correct.
Yeah.
And there was an old saying that I learned when I was doing trail work. They said, if you want something to last forever, you build it with stone. If you want it to last 10 years longer, you use locust. So it's very rot resistant.
Wow.
But
Wow.
I think has an ability to sprout from stumps and from root suckers, and can take over a site. So people can consider it invasive, even though it's native to North America.
Yeah. Talk to me about deer. Everyone sees deer, little Bambi.
Yep.
And I used to love little Bambi, and I still do. They eat everything in my yard, all my ornamental shrubs and everything.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about deer, and is that considered an invasive, or how do you characterize that?
I wouldn't consider it an invasive. It's a native species.
Yeah, it is native, absolutely.
And it's just essentially through human intervention and manipulation of the landscape, removal of some of the other predators to deer, and fragmenting the landscape and parcelizing it and putting up houses and creating lawns with ornamental bushes around it that they seem to love, has just created a habitat for them that they're thriving in, and essentially is a place where we can't control them through our traditional methods, through hunting or the other species that used to prey on them, wolves and things like that. So. But it is, the deer overpopulation issue is a big problem in the forest and land conservation community as well. They are severe, where they are overpopulated, they can severely and negatively affect the understory plants in a forest, and essentially eliminate all understory plants growing in a forest. And that has a ripple effect on a lot of other species, on the whole forest, but also specific species. There are, wildflowers that aren't coming back in certain areas. There are a lot of other, particularly bird species that require kind of low shrubby areas or mid-story plants for their nesting and foraging and things like that. And in places where the deer population is too high, we're not getting those multi-layered forests, so it's degrading the habitat for some of those other species.
I see. So there's quite a chain of events that any species. I mean, we're not just picking on the deer here.
Yeah.
But if you have overpopulation of any species, they're going to tend to perhaps feed on. Well, in the case of the deer, the understory of the forest.
Yeah.
And birds need some of that understory, and probably other mammals
Definitely
need that understory.
Yeah, and it will, overpopulation of anything could have some negative effects down the road on other things. And that goes back to a little bit of my comment earlier about how forests are changing, but they're changing slowly. And this would be a change that people might not notice, but decades down the road, when we can't regenerate new tree species underneath, and the trees that are in the overstory die or fall over from storm events or things like that, it could change the landscape.
Yeah. What's the oldest trees that we have at Prouty? Or
probably, I'd venture to guess, somewhere between 100 and 150 years old.
And would those tend to be, I've seen some large oaks down there, but also some white pines, some large white pines.
Yeah, and some of the, like I said, most of this landscape had been completely cleared for agriculture.
Yeah.
As you know, Prouty Woods is crisscrossed with stone walls.
Absolutely.
So most of those trees would have come in after, farm abandonment, but there are certain areas where maybe it's seen less management since then, where there's, a concentration of some older trees. And some of those big old, pasture pines or cabbage pines, we call them, they have the multiple tops as opposed to a single straight stem, are more signs of, old field habitat that got reclaimed by pine trees. And when those trees were young, they were affected by an insect called the white pine weevil, which would kill the terminal leader and create competition among the side branches. Those would turn upwards and try and become the new main leader. And that's what creates those multi-topped or multi-stemmed pine trees.
I see. Interesting.
So those trees are relatively old, but essentially did come back after farm abandonment.
Yeah, I would think also that perhaps some of the larger trees we see around, they may have been serving as sentries by a wall or something like that, or to give the cows a little shade, maybe.
Yeah. Yep.
Something
True.
like that. But you mentioned stone walls, and we'll put a visual up for our audience. But I'm sure you remember, this
Yes,
project where all
I do.
those stone walls on. Prouty, and we'll show that to our audience. But there is quite a collection of stone walls, and it really lays testament to how the land was used.
Yeah, including, I don't know if you remember, there's that one,
Right here.
old lane, essentially two stone walls, probably 10 or 12 feet apart.
Yes.
Those probably used to drive livestock from maybe down in Littleton Common up to the lake.
Yeah, keep your animals orderly. And there was another long one right here.
Yeah.
Yep. Very interesting. You get some beautiful views from on top of
Wilderness Hill.
Prouty. Wilderness Hill. And there's a house up there.
There is.
What's behind that house up there? What's going on there?
Well, that was a house that was on the property when we purchased the property from the Proutys in 2003. And we're currently using it to house some staff and seasonal workers, some interns. That's the main use.
I
And
see.
we use the grounds up there as well for some educational programs as well.
Yeah. Is that does that place have heat in it?
Yes.
Yes. So you-
Part of the building is heated with an oil furnace, but then it's supplemented by wood stoves.
Yeah. Yeah, what a view. Monadnock,
Yep.
things to the northwest. Absolutely.
Yeah, on a clear day, it's really
it's
really beautiful.
Yeah, spectacular view. We did an earlier show up there. I know there's a couple programs going on at Prouty. You have the Restoration Chestnut Orchard. You want
Yep.
to say a few words about that?
Sure. Yeah, when we moved into the property, shortly after that, folks from the American Chestnut Foundation approached us to see if we'd be interested in having a chestnut orchard there to continue some of their work to restore the American chestnut to what it used to be and try and breed a blight-resistant American chestnut tree. I don't know if your audience is familiar with the plight of the American chestnut, but it was a very common tree in the eastern United States.
Billions
They
of
say
them.
1 in 4 trees between Maine and Georgia was a chestnut tree.
Yes.
And with some areas where there were pure stands of it. It was a very important tree for a number of perspectives. The nuts were highly valued by all sorts of wildlife as well as humans, both Native Americans and early colonists, as a source of food. Valuable for lumber as well, and also another very rot-resistant species, so it was good for a number of uses. And then in the late 1800s or early 1900s, a chestnut from Asia was brought over that had a disease in it, the chestnut blight we call it,
Right.
that essentially wiped out chestnuts in the United States,
Yeah.
American chestnuts in the eastern United
And
States.
it wiped them out very quickly.
It did.
Very, very quickly, because we had billions of chestnuts from Georgia up to Maine, and we really don't have any now. Although we still have the stumps are there, and they try to regenerate, but
Exactly.
they succumb to the blight.
Yeah, so chestnut was a prolific sprouter from stumps, and when those parent trees die, new sprouts come from that stump, and they'll survive until they get to a certain age, and the bark structure develops to a place where the fungal spores can get in and affect the tree, and then it dies again and starts the sprouting process all over again.
So you have that project going on at Prouty, and people can come in and look at the chestnut orchard. And you have a new project going on there now behind the orchard, the community farm.
Yep, the Littleton Community Farm. This is the end of I think our second year working with them. So we leased them a few acres just behind the chestnut orchard as a community farm place for them to grow vegetables, offer a CSA program, community supported agriculture, where people can come in and buy a share and receive fresh vegetables each week throughout the summer. But they also have an educational component around their program, what they're trying to do, and teach people about agriculture and its importance. And it was a great opportunity for us to kind of cross-pollinate with that. When they were bringing people in to educate them about agriculture, we can, potentially have an opportunity to educate them about forests and forestry, and vice versa. When we bring people into the woods to show them our forests, they see the farm there and how well forests and agriculture work together.
Yeah, I know for the years that I've gone up to the Prouty, I looked behind the chestnut orchard, and I always saw that field there, and I said, boy, that'd be a great field to farm or to do something like that. So that's really great that's going on there. What can the average person or homeowner do in their day-to-day life to support forests? Maybe from the interest of sustainability, or diversity, or...
It's a good question. I'd say one thing that we would probably encourage folks to do, or there are a few things, but one would be to support forest conservation. One of our big missions is to conserve and promote the health of New England's forests. So by working with organizations like New England Forestry Foundation, Littleton Conservation Trust, there's a whole host of organizations throughout the region, the state, that work on those kinds of things. So that's one thing that people can do. Another thing that might seem counterintuitive would be to use more wood. By using wood and supporting local wood products industries, you're making forests more valuable and less susceptible to being converted to other uses, houses and things like that. So we're very interested in keeping our forests as forests, but economics is a big part of that. Because forest land, owning forests costs money. There's taxes and other expenses that you've got. So unless people can pay their bills, it's harder for them to.
What an interesting perspective. So using wood properly in a sustainable fashion will actually support the forests because it makes them valuable. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, good argument. Where is Prouty located?
We're on Foster Street, but it's better or easily accessed off of Wilderness Road. It goes up between Fay Park and the municipal parking lot next to the fire station.
Next to the fire station, okay. And they just drive up there, and there's a little parking area.
Yep, at the big white barn. There's parking there. There's a little kiosk where you could start walking on the trails, see the Chestnut Orchard and the Littleton Community Farm to the right. And you can go farther up to the top of the hill or down to the lake.
Yeah, it's a beautiful area to walk. I've walked it, numerous times, all the seasons, and it's a beautiful place. I want to thank you a lot for being here and telling us the story of New England Forestry Foundation, NEFF.
Yep. Yeah, thanks for having me.
And Prouty. And I do have to say, one of the things at Prouty that always strikes me as pure New England is you have a candlepin bowling alley.
Yes.
That is so New England, it just does my heart good to know that.
Another
that's
remnant of the Prouties. They were an incredible family.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Chris, thank you very much. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this segment of Your Backyard. I encourage you to take advantage of the Prouty Woods Community Forest and all the conservation lands that are in Littleton. Thank you, and we'll see you again.